Natana, putting together an encyclopedia of this scope is quite an undertaking. What got you involved in this particular project?
I was approached by Oxford University Press. We had just finished the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Islamic World, and they wanted to do a few spin-off volumes. They wanted one to cover Islam and law, one to cover Islam and politics, one on Islam, science, and medicine. And then they asked about the possibility of doing one on Islam and women. And I had some concerns about breaking off women as a separate topic at first because I was concerned that we might fall into the trap of looking at women as a side story rather than as part of the main narrative. But we had enough freedom within the way we constructed the encyclopedia to make sure, or at least try to make sure, that that didn't happen. By including women as part of the main narrative, writing about standard kinds of subjects, dynasties and political issues, legal issues, religious interpretation, but making sure to highlight women's roles and contributions within them. So we felt that it was an opportunity to add to the conversation rather than to take part in a side conversation.
Encyclopedias take a while to be put together, and certainly much has been happening in the Islamic world over the last few years. Did recent developments pose challenges for you and the editorial staff?
Well, we certainly had our hands full trying to keep up with contemporary events. The encyclopedia took us 3 years from its inception to the time that it was published, so it was a fairly short timeline. And within that, we had different events that took place, the most important of which was the Arab Spring. That happened right in the middle of the project. And so there were certain articles that needed to be expanded and revised. We had some that needed to be added fairly close to the end. One of our area editors actually was living on Tahrir Square, and she ended up having to scale back her level of participation as an editor, not only because of the events in Tahrir Square, but then she was also asked to join the Constitutional Writing Committee. And we felt that was probably a higher importance than finishing up with the encyclopedia project. So we had a very close board of editors who worked together to try to stay on top of contemporary events and to make sure that we were all contributing as much as we could. And then there were a few scholarly discoveries that took place as well. We were probably about 6 months from the end of the project and learned of 2 young scholars who had found 2 female Ayatollahs in Iran. So we have to include that. This is such an important development. And so there were some articles that were added in fairly late in the process just because we had just learned about those topics but felt they were really important to include.
What was the process by which entry topics were determined, and was it difficult to get contributors?
We initially started with a standard set of topics that Oxford University Press had proposed to us, and then we decided that we wanted to try to do things a little bit differently. Usually, for example, you have one topic that covers religion, and we decided that we wanted to split out religious interpretation, theory, and practice into one subcategory, and we wanted to do a different category to cover Islamic law because of its importance. We decided to do a unit on self and body because we wanted to show that women's bodies are not just things that are acted upon by society, by the state, by men, but we also wanted to show women's agency in being able to make decisions for themselves. So we looked at old topics but tried to do it in a new and hopefully fresher kind of way. We had, I think in the end, only one topic we ended up discarding altogether, and this was an article. What we found was that we had more trouble trying to narrow it down. We originally started with about 700 articles, and the press came back to me at one point and said, you know, my goodness, this is all wonderful, but it's just too much for 2 volumes. Can you try to cut down on this? I said, oh, well, okay, we'll cut back on it, but with the proviso that maybe we can add these back in as the project expands over time. And in the end, we had 451 articles, 267 contributors from 38 different countries. And I think one of the most exciting parts of working on this project was the level of enthusiasm that we met with, that we approached senior scholars, mid-level scholars, junior scholars, and even many of the most senior scholars said, oh, you know, I have all these writing commitments, I have all these things to do, but this topic is so important, this encyclopedia is so important, I'm going to make time to write this. So we actually had a lot of people coming to us asking to write for it, rather than our having to go and necessarily dig them all up. And I thought that was a very exciting aspect of it. It shows the importance of the topic.
Were there any topics you wish were included, but for one reason or another weren't?
I would have loved to have included more biographies, and that involved some conversation with the press. There was some concern that if we had too many biographies, it might look like we were following the great man in history approach, but doing the great woman in history approach. And my argument for including the biographies was that one of the frustrations in working on the topic of women and gender in the Islamic world, particularly from a religious perspective, is that many times when I meet with sheikhs and ulama, I hear that, well, you know, women cannot serve in X, Y, and Z roles because women have never done this. And so I thought it was really important to restore those biographies so that, you know, now we have 1,260-something odd pages. Well, yes, women did, and here you go. Here are 2 volumes that show you that they did. And so the biographies were included not to follow the great woman in history approach, but really to give us the opportunity to say, here are some women who highlight examples of what we're talking about and show in their life stories the multiple identities that they had and the many different levels at which they made contributions to their societies. And we have women from different empires, different time periods, serving in roles as legal scholars, certainly as Quran reciters, as transmitters of hadith. These are very central activities in religious knowledge. And we felt it was very important to restore those voices to history, as well as to include contemporary women who are taking the issues to the next level.
There's such a variety of scholarly disciplines in the encyclopedia. Is any one dominant, or is representation of approaches fairly well distributed?
We tried to do as much distribution as we could, but I think inevitably we ended up with more politics and polity. I think that was one of our heaviest topics, and we certainly had a lot on Islamic law, a lot on culture and society, not as many on immigration and minorities. Those tended to be more theoretical articles. And that was, the distribution was due in part because of concerns that we wanted to be comprehensive in our coverage. So we tried to cover as many countries as we could to give some idea of what women's participation had been throughout history. And simply because of the number of countries that exist in the world, that necessitated a lot of different articles.
Oxford University Press has published the encyclopedia in paper and print formats. Does the press intend to treat both the same, or will the electronic version have a different life?
I believe that the online version will have a different kind of life. Part of the advantage of online versions is that you can constantly update them. And Oxford's been very good with Islamic Studies Online of doing updates usually every 3 months, sometimes every 6. And that means that we can constantly add to the content. We can add revisions where they're needed. And eventually they may produce a revised version of the print edition, but print editions are more limited in terms of the amount of revising you can do on a regular basis. Islamic Studies Online has also given us the opportunity to take some scholars and delve more deeply into their work. We have an interview coming up with Dr. Naila Khan, who is talking about the women's movement in Jammu and Kashmir, an area we don't hear very much about. Her grandparents were very involved in the independence movements there, and her grandmother was particularly involved in women's rights. So that interview, I believe, will be appearing in the next online edition. One other thing we want to do with the online edition is to produce a chronology that's based on Islam and women, to add to the chronologies of the Islamic world and world history that are already there. And I'd like to do that both separately so that it can be looked at individually, but to make sure that we also wrap it back into Islamic history to show that women are not that sideshow, which was something we tried to avoid since the beginning.
Do you have any thoughts about this encyclopedia's influence on Islamic studies scholarship?
We are hoping that it will open the door to recognizing that there are multiple ways of looking at women's contributions to Islamic scholarship. Right now, I think there's more of a tendency to look at contemporary contributions simply because there are so many of them. So we're hoping that providing some of that historical grounding will make it a richer and deeper conversation. We're also hoping to have an impact on women's rights activism, especially in the events of the Arab Spring, where women's rights seem to be an issue that's on the table. Will women continue to have the rights that they had before these revolutions? Will they be expanded? Will they be curtailed or even eliminated altogether? And the hope is that by having a solid scholarly foundation for arguing for a greater role in public life, that will have an impact. And I've personally hand-delivered copies of that encyclopedia to both Saudi Arabia and Qatar, so I'm hoping that will have some impact in both places.
Were the Boston College libraries helpful in your research for this project?
I think the Boston College's library has been very helpful, both in terms of the collection that's already here. I particularly like the electronic resources application where we have certain ebooks make it much easier to access from home. And I would certainly mention the interlibrary loan department that's been very helpful in getting us access to materials that we don't have. They've been wonderfully efficient and very, very helpful in tracking down sometimes very difficult sources.
What's your next project?
My next project? Well, I have several, but I think the most important one related to Islam and women is that I want to write a 200 to 300 page book that would take the information we've brought to light in that encyclopedia and put it into a narrative that helps to retell the story of Islamic history, including women as part of that main narrative. I've already started working on it. Hoping it won't take much more than a year to finish. But I think it's very important. Most people will not sit down and read an encyclopedia cover to cover. It's not what it's designed for. But they will sit down and read a narrative of Islamic history that's 200 to 300 pages, and hopefully it could be adopted for courses then as well.